hallway chats we've been having in between these sessions. And welcome, Pat. So great to have you. You have a room full of students, industry experts, fellows, and deep data science experts as well. So welcome, Pat. We've already introduced you, and maybe you want to just sort of let the room know kind of a little bit about you. They already know, but if you just want to introduce yourself, and then we'll start with some questions.
Hey, very good. Thank you, Liz, and pleasure to join the session today. Obviously, 45 years in the technology industry, probably one of the few humans on Earth who've gone from the top of the stack in software, to the lowest level of physics in the transistor, and engineer, geek at heart. Love the power of technology. Recently retired from Intel and starting to get much more involved in a company called Glue, and where faith meets technology. But that's probably one of several things that I'll be more involved in going forward, and quite enjoy any opportunity to be in front of a Harvard audience like this. So let's take it away, Liz.
Thank you so much. This is great to have you. So you have been at the center of multiple technology revolutions, and now we've got this thing called AI, which we are talking about today as being incredibly multifaceted, not easy to pin down what it quite is. And are we talking Gen AI? Are we talking AI? And it's a black box. How do you think of AI? And when you describe it, what's the world that you'd use to describe sort of the concept of AI?
Yeah, and clearly, AI, as in a lot of technologies, it's many decades of pain, suffering, and agony, and all of a sudden, it's an overnight success. And since the first declaration in 1958 around AI, plenty of AI winters, and some of the CEOs and I were chatting recently, and it says all it is algorithms and data. And in many respects, it's a whole lot of compute capacity with a whole lot of data and some very clever algorithms. That said, this ability now, with large language models, neural networks, multimodal RAG, you're able to predict and deliver prediction technologies that are really quite spectacular. So, and in many respects, the ability now, right, to, predict what language you would want to have coming out, large language models, being able to do image generation, to be able to tackle problems, right, that weren't, conceivably before. If I was trying to write an algorithm to do this, now, essentially software is writing software, and it really is pretty spectacular, this phase of computing breakthrough that we're in right now. And I believe we're, in about year 1 or 2 of the utilization of AI, and we have a good couple of decades in front of us, much like when we first, saw the internet. And, when I remember my first internet experience, and it was almost like a holy moment, right? Man, I went on the Mosaic browser and I used the internet today, and I might do it again tomorrow, right? Now, right, if I keep my teenager off of the internet for 10 seconds, I've literally ruined their existence, right? And AI is going to be that way over the next couple of decades, that it truly will get integrated into every aspect of human existence, every experience. And also, 1 or 2 more analogies. If you think about the computing, experience over the last 50 years, we've been adapting to computers. Right now with AI, computers will adapt to us. Right, in language, vision, instruction. It was a funny thing, Liz, when Linda and I first started dating. My wife, Linda, she asked me, "Do you speak any other languages?" And I says, "Yeah, I speak a dozen languages, and I'm working on English, Fortran, C, assembly, Lisp, Pascal, etc." And now computers are truly adapting to human language interfaces, understanding context, et cetera. And much of that will be because of the power of AI.
Pat, do you think, if thinking about consumers conforming to us, or the computers conforming to us, do you think that we as humans are overly swayed by the personalization journey and not worried as much about the lack of transparency and explainability?
Well, I do think, and so we're certainly going to get into that a little bit more, Liz, in our conversation, today. I think in many respects you always have the enthusiast and the pessimist, right, for any technology. I also think with that, transparency, openness, accountability of the technology is critical to address it. I also see that technologists need to be in the discussion. And, I've had numerous conversations with senators and other legislative, individuals. And, it's mystery, right? It's hard to understand. And to expect a trained lawyer, right, to fully comprehend the arc of technology when technologists debate the arc of technology themselves, that's impossible. It behooves us to be at the table, for these conversations, to shape the technology, to establish the social norms, to be creating the legal and regulatory frameworks around it.
I tell every lawyer I know to get to know data scientists and technologists and really take them to coffee and learn from them. Okay, well, Pat, so when you think about AI, I know you're very bullish on AI, and I love that about you, and I also know that you're committed to trust. But when you think about misconceptions about AI, how should leaders, and you are one of the foremost ones, how should leaders and regulators respond?
Well, I think every piece of it needs, to be, say thoroughly debated, openly, chewed upon, and challenged. And as business leaders and those in the seminar here, you need to go experience it. And right now on my screen, I keep open Copilot, ChatGPT, and Gemini. Right, and I'm using them all the time. I'm posing them questions all the time, right, and testing how they respond, seeing hallucinations, see where they get it wrong and get it right. And each one of you should be doing the same thing, right? You should be using it, right? In your groups, in your teams, right? You should be, starting to find those early use cases for AI and putting it to work in the business setting. And if you don't have a lot of those, prototype and early experiences going on, as some have said, there's going to be two kinds of companies in the future: those that are AI enabled, and those that are dead. And I do think in that respect, so many different business functions are going to be fundamentally changed as a result, that every business leader needs to be determining, how does it affect me? How do I enable new productivity? How do I create new use cases? And how do you deal with the bad stuff, right? Because like any radical new technology, there's going to be lots of bumps in the night, as you're trying to figure out how to deploy it, in different business settings.
So I hear you as saying then that not using AI is as an existential risk for organizations.
Yeah. Absolutely. And some of it, by the way, is just, right, like we had a couple of use cases inside of Intel where we started to, we trained a model on all of our fab data. And, the fab is like the holy of holies for a company like Intel. And fab data is like double firewalled, air gapped, separated from, everything, because this is the crown jewels of running the company. So attacking a use case in the core of the fab, was one of those, just absolutely critical examples of how we were putting it to work. And so we started to use it to literally do 100% inspection across every machine, right? Every step of an individual machine. And what we found was, we were able to detect variations much more quickly as a result. But, all of a sudden we were generating tickets, right? Operations that needed to occur because of machine, variations or individual lot variations, or even down to the individual die variation, that we overwhelmed, right, the rest of the systems and processes that go for it, that utilize the creation of those, tickets, because now we have so much new generation of data and information. So it broke all of the other fab processes to try to deploy it. So it was an incredible early learning for us. So everybody in fab was ready to put it to work, but it also broke many other aspects of how we were running the fab operations as we started to try to put it to work. And to me, those use cases, you all need to do those, right? In your site, you need to, find those early use cases, try them, break things, and, focus the organization on the ones that really give meaningful value to the different groups.
I've heard you say, fix it fast.
Yeah, and Silicon Valley is well known for get to a as rapidly as possible, a product market fix, break quickly, fix it fast. But when you have a technology like AI, I think it's hard to imagine a more exciting opportunity to think about how you can deploy those kind of methodologies.
Yeah, I think everyone here is committed to experimentation. We've heard a lot of really thoughtful questions. We've been talking a lot about trust and how AI success hinges on trust, in that leadership of a company knows that consumer trust and stockholder and board trust all hinges on their successful deployment and design in certain cases of AI. What are the biggest trust hurdles you have seen and heard of, and how do we overcome them? It's a broad question.
Well, I think everybody in the room has heard about hallucinations and things like that from AI models and deployments. And the amazing thing is you get super comfortable with, a AI system giving you answers. So when it gives you something that's dead wrong, you start to trust it, right? And it does so with such authoritative clarity that, all of a sudden you have a hard time. And when you realize you've just been duped, right, then you question the underlying trust of the system itself. And, I do think that there are still enormous domains of, trust building that need to come with AI. Now, obviously, as you then start thinking about some of those foundational models, training it with your data in your context has been shown to increase the efficacy dramatically. Compared to like a trillion parameter model, if I take a 70 billion parameter model, train it on my local data, I get accuracy and precision against my topics, radically exceeding models that are an order or two orders of magnitude larger. So again, this is learning how to put it to work in your environment. I've also, I posted a blog that went viral after DeepSeek, and arguing that one of the things that DeepSeek spanked some of the U.S. cloud companies with was their openness. They openly published many of the aspects of their training data. They openly published the model weights that they had used in the entire architecture of the multimodal models that they had created. And in response to that, Sam Altman came and he, responding to my blog post, he says, maybe OpenAI is on the wrong side of history.
That was boss.
Right, meaning that, okay, maybe we do need to be far more open. And I think about this as, that open, right, ends up being, a critical aspect. And, I've been just running my career, by that principle of openness, USB, Wi-Fi, processor buses and architectures and so on. And I do think that openness, trust, how are we going to benchmark AI systems? How are we going to know they're accurate? Right, we can run the LSAT test score. Or we can, say, they passed, the chemistry exam. But we're also embedding our character, our nature into these models. So it's far more important. It's going to be, much more qualitative metrics that, can I trust it? Is it representing my values? I think I mentioned the story to you, Liz, in one of our conversations, but, I was with Prime Minister Modi and his chief of technology, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who used to work for me at Intel. So I'm meeting with the two of them, and we were talking about AI transparency, AI models, and they were horrified by how ChatGPT responded to questions about Indian sovereignty as they were overseen by those vicious English, right, for the years of imperialism. right? And that might, and we will train our own models because it will represent our view of Indian history, our values, etc. And I think AI will probably be one of the most important technologies to represent the values of individual communities, of societies, of people groups, of faith groups, of legal requirements. And in that sense, I think the training and precision associated with it to different audiences will be essential for it to become truly trusted and useful in business content in different contexts.
I love that. We talked a lot today about how trust, well, really, how sort of values are subjective, and jurisdictions have different sort of content. I mean, you take different approaches to what is fair, what is ethical. It varies quite a bit based on the continent, on, and also within organizations themselves, it varies based on their risk appetite, and everything is contextual. It could be industry, jurisdiction, risk tolerance from the leadership, et cetera. And I know that you are very focused on and values-centered AI, so I'm eager to get there. I wonder if you can talk about sort of the social media wave. You've seen a lot of different waves. The trust and distrust in social media. And I'm a parent of teenagers, and so I have a range of views here. But how do you think they have shaped AI expectations, and what lessons can companies take from past mistakes with social media?
Yeah, and if you look at social media, and I'll claim, and some in the audience may applaud me, some may disdain me, but I helped to create the net neutrality laws, that became the Section 230 that have governed many aspects of the internet. And so having been in some of those earliest days, right, of the internet days, and many of those legal precedences were what enabled the internet companies to become these powerhouses of both business and technology today. However, as we've seen in the course of that, there was no accountability for the presence of the content on their platform, right? And as a result, we could see search results that lead people to very unacceptable behavior over time, implications that, are degradations of humanity, that have led to the abuse of children and, to, search patterns that are, driven solely to, maintain click-throughs and, keep long presences, with much, much higher affinities, toward, less positive content. And there was no accountability for that through the social media platforms. And I think all of us look at that today and say, how did we let that happen? How did that occur? Where, right, we're seeing people click through to flat earth scenarios or, for, child bullying on the internet, and there is no framework that demands those social media platforms to take accountability for that. Reading some of the data that, has been published on this, if one child is abused, that's unacceptable. And to say that we have as many good as many abusive situations in approximate equality, right, and to call that okay, that's hideous. Now, as we fast forward, to the AI era, I believe that it's critical, incumbent, upon a values-based view, because just connecting a search, to a content source, is way less meaningful than actually embedding values into the underlying AI models themselves. This one is much more important, much more substantial, and will have longer-term consequences on the future of technology. So I do believe this idea of, a values-based view, of a faith-based view, showing up at the table to help shape the requirements. And we need proper benchmarks. We need processes by which we're saying that was good or that was not good. And I've long held this phrase of technology as a force for good, where, technology itself is neutral. All right, the printing press that can print good stuff or bad stuff. Technology can be used for war, or it can be used for flourishing and health improvements. Technology, neutral. How do we shape it as a force for good? And some of that is in the evolution of the technology itself. Some of that's in the social and policies that we put around the uses and deployments of those technologies.
I was thinking about what you were saying earlier about social media, a previous conversation that you and I had, and I was thinking about, there was a lawsuit last year, a woman in Florida sued Character AI and Google for what contributions she believed led to her son's suicide, which is just one of those things that gives you chills, especially if you have kids. And then the lawyer in me said, well, what was the claim? Like, what's the claim is she making? And is there an expectation interest that the AI company would have some sort of like empathy, at a certain level that would dissuade someone from suicide? And the courts will reject it. If a lawsuit has no merit, they'll issue a summary judgment and it's done. This case is still pending. It's still being worked through. So it'll be interesting to see, and I'm very eager to see, 230 laws make for relatively no liability, but will the AI companies now inherit liability because people are saying there's got to be a higher standard because we are now relying on these for autism companions and increasingly relationship companions. I mean, as for the elderly, on and on and on. So I think it will be very interesting in the court system to see what expectation, what is the standard of duty of care, to use legal terms, that AI companies have to abide by, and what is the consumer expectation? Anyway, I know. Yeah, please.
And I was just going to pile on to that, Liz. I love when I hear you talk like that. Because I think there will need to be, laws, established in this regard, social expectations established, because I think the legal frameworks will be one domain of importance, but also where do our, consumer dollars go? Right? Where there'll be a view of, I'm not going to put it on that social media platform because they're denigrating my human values, but then there has to be a good alternative, right? If I have a great values and a lousy user experience versus a great user experience and lousy values, I have a lousy choice, right? Versus having a great media, a great consumer experience that also reflects my values. And, and I really view, and part of our objectives with Glue, are to say that it's not compromising. It's going to be great values and a great experience for my values as well. One more thing I think, as well is, I do think that AI will be so important globally, that I do think it's not just, how we establish those laws in the US, but what does Europe look like, UK, India, and the other global implications as well as local laws. Right, there's going to be many aspects of this that are going to affect locally as well. So I think this is, for social norms, for legal policy considerations and precedences, and what the consumer and business requirements are. This is going to be a stunning decade in front of us.
It will be a stunning decade. We did a pulse survey in the first session about differential pricing, and would sort of the room, we kind of posed it to the room, if you knew that you were, by some immutable characteristic that you had, being charged a different price and you couldn't control it by a company that you patronize in some commodity goods. We just sort of threw this out there. Pretty much the whole room said yes. You'd vote with your feet and use a different company if it were available. And I think we're seeing that to me, small sample size, but still, I think it shows that we will be responsive to values or lack thereof in what these AI companies are doing. And if we notice that they're doing something that is not in line with our values, like equity, charge us the same. I mean, unless you don't care. There's different things. You might care if you get charged less. But I think that sort of the embodiment of the principles into the design of the AI and then the communication thereof of like, this is what we stand for and this is what we're putting forward. And then the fix it fast for where it fails, I think is a very big deal. I know you really have such a unique perspective from Intel and VMware having set global tech standards, which is kind of mind-boggling. And, USB, Wi-Fi, cloud, what do you think is needed to establish AI governance in alignment with the human values that you're talking about now?
Yeah. And a couple of just fun little stories. USB, deeply believed in the criticality of an open interface. And in fact, one of the few occasions where Steve Jobs was wrong was where he and I clashed over USB versus FireWire. And how many of you in the audience use FireWire today? You don't even know what it exists anymore. How many of you use USB? Okay, we crushed them, right? With an open standard called USB. So, that's a missing chapter in Isaacson's book. I told him that so that he should add that one. But when my granddaughter plugs the USB stick into a computer, she says, "Thank you, Papa."
Nice legacy.
And with Wi-Fi, when we were driving the establishment of Wi-Fi, I mean, today all of us look at it and says, "Oh, of course, Wi-Fi," right? But when we were driving its standardization and global consistency, the idea of broad unlicensed spectrum, right, was hideous in the industry, right? Because we were hated by the telcos because they thought they should own and monetize all spectrum in a licensed way. We were hated by the broadcasters because they thought they should own all spectrum, own it and control it in a licensed way. And we were hated by the defense community because they thought they should own all licensed spectrum and use it for national security purposes. So I remember, like yesterday, in my first congressional hearing on the formation of the unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi, and then we had to go drive that consistency across U.S., Europe, and China, right? And in 1 year, I made 7 trips to China, right, to fight as the ITU representative to go drive Wi-Fi standardization across China as well. Some of these things were stunning at the time, and now you look back at them and you say, "Oh, of course." Right? When did we have a world without Wi-Fi? Well, I can tell you when we didn't have a world with Wi-Fi in it. And each of these were challenging. They were hard, right? They required, communities and politics to be formed. And similarly, with AI, we're going to need to set the benchmarks. What are the requirements for openness, right? When companies try to put forward models that hallucinate, how are they going to be held accountable, for those? What will be the standards that the industry requires for trust and values as well? And as models are released, they can't just be measured on how performant they are. They have to be also measured on how accurate and trustworthy they are. And that's only going to be seen by independent, neutral. Some of those will be monitored and managed by universities. We're going to have to establish benchmarking organizations, that are neutral, independent, and trusted. And we're going to have to do that on a global basis as well, because the Europeans will have different views. The Indians, Chinese will have different views of that as well. But it's going to be a lot of work. But at the end of the day, I'll say this technology is so powerful, so critical, we must do that work.
I share your view. I wonder if you have anything that, given your vision in sort of decades past, do you have any unpopular opinion, and maybe it's open source, because I know that's a huge push of yours, an unpopular approach to like what needs to happen that others are like, wait, what? No. Do you see any of that right now? Are you experiencing friction?
Well, one of before I had the pleasure to join you all today, I was on a policy forum this morning with a number of policy influencers, people like Estevez, who led BIST under the Biden administration, the export, or BIS, the Export Control Policy setting agency. And in that discussion, there's huge debate on should models be open? Should they be able, that Chinese could be able to take an open model and be able to copy us more quickly, right? There are also questions on should we have open export policies for some of these technologies, because they could be copied. But then also you see that if we're too restraining on the technology, export and availability, then things like DeepSeek occur, where, the entire nation can put together all of their GPUs and compute. And if they can't get them from the US, then the only thing they can do is go engineer it themselves. And they will, right? And then we lose control of the underlying technologies as well as the AI technologies. So I think a number of these things, export policy, US, China, competitiveness, these are going to be areas that get a lot of scrutiny, a lot of debate, and my firm alignment on the open, transparent side of that are going to be highly scrutinized, because some will say, hey, the best way that we can protect our models, is by keeping them highly proprietary. Well, highly proprietary AI models mean there's only going to be a few companies that can create them, right? Because the cost associated, with a high-end model training, will be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Which means no startup company will ever be able, to, start up with that kind of hurdle, right, to getting some advanced capabilities underway. So many of these things are going to be heavily debated, and you can be confident, Liz, that I'm going to get thrown under the bus a few times for some of my views on this. And, at the same time, I'll probably enjoy some of the opposition, just because that's the kind of person I am.
I think you've developed thick skin on this one. Well, so here we are at Harvard, and I know that you track pretty closely with the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. So that identifies well-being, relationships, meaning, and health as keys to thriving life. How can AI be governed to enhance and not erode the flourishing of human life?
Yeah, and I think in this respect, we have to create frameworks that allow people to measure good, to measure flourishing. And one of the things I quite liked about the Human Flourishing program is trying to identify these different domains, right, and then put real engineering and real quantitative metrics that can then be supporting these largely, qualitative, right, kind of characteristics. And, to me, that's what's going to be required here is, good, solid research, that can be turned into, real benchmarks, real test cases that allow us to measure human flourishing. And wellness. How are we going to know wellness? How are we going to know that the platforms are bringing us to having greater social connectedness versus greater social isolation? How will we know, that they're representing our values? And in some cases, that means, hey, as a Judeo-Christian, largely society, we may have a different set of answers than somebody that might be from a Muslim or an atheistic point of view. We're going to have to give room for those different perspectives, even where, the systems themselves need to have solid underpinnings that meet engineering, scrutiny, and real introspection, by communities across the world that have different point of views.
Yeah, I think the pragmatist in me really loves when people can sort of anchor to something that already exists and has been very well thought through. And I think that flourishing is 1938. I think it started. I mean, it is a time-tested, decades-tested study of human flourishing, and I think it's wonderful to tie when you're starting to say, like, when data scientists at McKinsey would come to me, I used to be the general counsel of digital, they'd come to me and they'd say, oh, I programmed something for fairness. And I thought, how do you define fairness? And they're like, well, what's fair? And I'm like, you have to pin it to some regulation. Like, there's civil liberties laws. You'll pin it in the U.S. to protected classes. That's what fair is defined as in the U.S. So I love tying sort of AI, what would be considered values oriented, or you could just say, well, we're tying it to the dimensions of the Harvard, project study on human flourishing, just because you're not trying to reinvent the wheel of every part of the component. So now this brings you to Glue, where you've been the chairman for a while, and I think you're now head of technology at Glue, or soon to take over. But I know that Glue's work is cutting edge in the AI space, rooted in faith, technology, and trust. And these, again, are, as we talked about, subjective and context dependent. But for you, how do these elements intersect? And how can AI serve diverse communities without imposing, a singular point of view on values?
Yeah, and if you go back to one of the topics that we touched on earlier, I'll say the faith community, the value-centered community, we didn't show up when many of the social media and internet norms were being established, right? It was like years later where we started to see some of the data. It was like, man, this sucks, right? How many flat world websites are there, right? You can't keep taking me to all these other things that, we all of a sudden saw in, the cases. We have to show up, right? And, we can't let that happen again, as occurred in the social media framework. And obviously, the work of Glue is a piece of that, and we're coming, with it with a very defined faith perspective, right? We want to be representing the faith community fully and wholesomely as part of those discussions. But we also want to be influential to make sure the values community shows up as well, for wellness, for health, all of those, for the social well-being of our relationships, our children, and those. So it really is faith and the value-centered community showing up, to participate in setting the AI standards of the future. And, obviously, expanding my role with Glue, been board chair for a while, getting more involved in helping to drive that, because I think we do have a point of view that matters. And, approximately 80% of humanity considers faith one of their most important aspects, of their life and priority. That number's, in the 60s in the United States. So, we start from a very, solid view. This is really important to large portions of humanity. But we also then have to say, hey, there's a lot of different views of faith perspective. How many denominations are there? We have to be very representative hey, we're transparent. We start from a Judeo-Christian, point of view, but we also have to say, hey, a Catholic would take a different perspective on certain aspects. And, one of the nice things about the evolution of AI technology is the RAG systems that you have today are actually pretty good about, being able to give you sufficient context to say, well, this is how the Catholic community would view some aspects of Mary and divinity and so on. And if you're a Muslim or a Hindu, you would take different perspectives. So we want to be broad in terms of enabling it, but entirely transparent. This is where we start, right? And, in that transparency, nobody ever be confused. When you're in Glue AI, that's where we start. But we want to enable this broader view of faith, right, across a diverse set of faiths, and then, of course, a broader community for values as well.
I find it fascinating, and I love your commitment to open source so that you can take another religion and say, from the Hindu perspective, I'll take the values, base that you've built and feed in what I think would be the right training data to reflect back the values of Hinduism. But we have a room full of very interesting and interested people, and I want to be able to pass the microphone to folks. Do you mind if we open this up to Q&A?
Yeah, please.
Okay. All right. Who has a question for Pat? Right in the front row.
Hi, Pat. Glad to have you here. I am also a proponent of open source models, and I'm glad there are a lot of companies and academics that are publishing these open source models. But if you look at the overall ecosystem there, other than some of the small models like 5.4 or Llama, DeepSeek, most of these big, large models that are open source, but they're still limited because you need massive compute to use them. If you talk about like 400 billion parameter models, there is no way someone can run those models locally, or most people don't have the compute to use them. I guess my question to you is, even though there are these open source models, there is still a barrier. How do you see that being resolved within the, let's say, 5 years or a decade, when the open source models would be truly good and also truly open source? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And let me give you like 5 different perspectives on the question. So, one of them is, I think the comment is fair because, at least so far, we have found no limit to the value of models getting bigger, right? So we continue to see, if you go from a 400 billion to a trillion parameter, et cetera, that continues to deliver value, right? So at the higher end of model sizes, that seems to continue, and all the research continues to say that as well. So I'll say, there's no limit on the intelligence of expanding training data sets, or at least it hasn't been found yet. But in some domains, we're running out of data. Right, and now you hear people talking about synthetic data and other things like that, and so I think there's a lot of things there, but I think there is some concern in that regard. But the other aspect, and this is one of the things that the DeepSeek and some of the comments have shown, is that hey, we can take a big model and distill it into a much smaller, more efficient model. right? And this whole idea of distillation and being able to, compress. But then also, another concept that's clearly shown efficacy is multi-model and RAG, where, I take, reasoning models across different domains and bringing them together, right? And those are typically much, much smaller, but they're cooperating on solving an overall AI workflow. And many of the retraining of those big models that, ends up in the open source community, right? Training on your data, right, on your domain is giving you superior results on dramatically smaller models, orders of magnitude smaller, right, that are easily runnable. And of course, compute continues to get cheaper. And today, a standard, CPU-based Xeon server, that fills every corporation data center can pretty effectively run a 70 billion parameter model, today. So, the economics, continue to improve, to run these models. Now, all of that said is technologically, and, the fourth point of this would be that, the cost of inferencing, and, I just, was public on a seed investment I did for a company called Fractal. My belief is that we need to decrease the cost of inferencing by about 10,000x. Not half, not 10x, not 100x, but like 10,000x to fully realize the use of AI that I would hope and envision, for us in the future. Because, training versus inferencing, we have to drive that cost of inferencing down dramatically. And the good news is I think so much energy, the best minds on the planet, so much capital, so much innovation, is going at that problem that I do think the cost of inferencing is going to continue to decline quite dramatically over time. And, as a result, that gap between the haves and the have-nots. Now, some will say, hey, there's going to be 2 AGI models in the world, right? They're going to be run by 3 companies and, so on like that. I don't buy that at all. Not at all. That's like when Watson said there's going to be 7 IBM computers running the world's compute needs. I believe that this just becomes pervasive. It's like the gas law. It's going to fill everything. And as long as we don't get protectionist, right, which is why I keep harping on open and trusted. As long as we don't get protectionist, the world's going to benefit from, hundreds and hundreds of innovations across, every domain by many different institutions, and it's going to become pervasive in every aspect. But, we'll go back to where we started. Get on board, right? This is the biggest change since the internet, and you all need to become very, comfortable with how you're going to use it.
Okay, Sri.
Thanks, Liz. Pat, that was a great talk. Thank you so much for sharing your views. For some of us who work in artificial intelligence risk, till last year, there was a lot of impetus in the United States. NIST had put out a bunch of frameworks on risk management for AI, and then EU has taken the lead, and they've created the EU AI Act. Now, I was hearing from someone, and the last 4 months, people have been talking about this bonfire of AI regulations, if you will. So everything's been thrown out the window, and people are discussing, like, what do you think about in the context of governance? What do you think about in the context of building frameworks? And how do you see companies think about, like, as product creators, if you're an AI builder or a company leveraging AI, what should companies be thinking about? And what should users of AI be thinking about as you start incorporating AI into your workflow? Right now, there are no specific regulations you need to follow, and everybody's driving towards innovation. But how do you factor risk into the whole picture, and how should companies be thinking about it?
Yeah, great question. A close friend of mine is Thierry Breton, who until a few weeks ago was the French representative to the EU, right? And he was the guy who drove the EU AI regulation. So personally, he and I argued about it, vicious debates, and Commissioner Breton is a fiery Frenchman if you ever saw one. But we're in a meeting, and there's a handful of commissioners in the meeting. Ursula von der Leyen is there, and I said, the world can sleep so well at night because the world does not need to regulate AI. Europe will take care of it for us. Right. And, of course, it was a very cynical view, but just like we saw on data protection and GDPR, the Europeans are regulatory happy, and the rest of the world, innovates around them, because they, have this extreme regulatory view. So, one aspect I would just say is, I'm pretty cautious, that we can get regulatory happy on a technology that we don't understand, and we could, cause the, I'll say, the quiescing, or the strangling, of the innovative cycle that we're in. So I do think from a regulatory perspective, even the technologists don't agree on many aspects of the technology itself. So how's a regulator going to get it right, when something is changing this rapidly and moving this quickly as well? So I'm just wanting to be cautious. That said, I do think, we have to show up. We need legal minds, we need social minds, we need technology minds, political leaders, to be at the discussion to help shape it, as a force for good, as I've said. I do think a lot of this needs to be done, through benchmarks. The only way that AI can be, I'll say, tested is with AI. So we're going to need models that are testing the AI itself, because that's the only thing that's going to be able to keep up, with the AI operations. And so, I do believe that there'll be, essentially this, this idea of systems testing systems and regulation, being embedded in AI models and testing, the AI results of larger or other systems as well. So AI must be deployed to verify, test, reinforce, or prove that the AI itself is being done correctly. And, I also think this is why, coming back to the earlier comments, open is going to be so important. So what data did you train the model on? Do I agree that's the right corpus of data? Getting, a bunch of highly biased, social media, feeds that have no, no basis, no protection, no, moderation of those. I don't know that I want them training my AI models, So I want to know what data was used and the corpus of the data that goes, behind them. I think we need to have accountability of the transparency of the underlying data training, model weights, et cetera, in this regard, so it does become trusted. But the final piece of this is, maybe one more little mind-stretching thought for you. We're in year 25 of the cloud, and now about 70% of computing is done in the cloud. But here we are in year 25 of the cloud, 80% of the data is still private and on-prem. Think about that for a second. So almost all of the good data is protected in private. It's not available in the public domain. And that's across medical, that's across financial, that's across operational data, et cetera. So you have this huge view that, my data is the crown jewels of my business and my operations as well. So this is where I think that many of the real deployments of AI will be done on locally trained data and models where you're training it for your purpose, And that's where you can get much higher accuracy, precision, and use against the use cases that you would have as well. So, expecting that you're going to have some generic, model that's been trained by social media and other things like that versus solving your problem, I do see the domain of localized AI being a huge one, for most business deployments.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Who has a really good one?
Might not be a great one.
It's going to be great.
I'm curious. My question is, if you can hear me, I noticed your facial expression when you mentioned synthetic data generation. So I wanted to know what your thoughts are on that. I think that IBM or Red Hat has an open source project. It's like an open open source LLM fine-tuning project where they use synthetic data generation. So I wanted to know what are your thoughts on that and the fact that it is open source and community driven, where I believe developers have the ability to submit information that can shape the models itself?
Yeah, maybe two different dimensions of an answer here. I think generally the academic community hasn't really given any consensual view of synthetic data yet, right? Whether it's better or not better, whether it helps model accuracy or not. So I'll say I don't know that I have any basis to say synthetic data is good or bad, right? In that regard. So I'll say the jury's probably still out on the value of synthetic data as a use for training models. Now, obviously, as you go to other fields like chemistry, biology, et cetera, there's a lot of data that's never been taken, right? How many molecules have been properly studied, so that I got data to go train my model. So you can imagine in some of these domains that the only way you're going to get data to train models to understand that domain will be with synthetic data. So I'll just say in that regard, trust, transparency, openness, I'll keep coming back to those principles because, if I've trained my model on all synthetic data, well, hey, I may or may not be getting the accuracy that I'm comfortable with for some of my use cases, but I want to know how it was trained, what it was trained on, and the implications of that. Now, the last piece of that is if we go back to the prior question, a lot of that data is held by corporates in their own vaults. Right, so there's a huge amount of data that hasn't been unleashed in that regard. And I also see that this area of licensing of data, hey, I want my data to be used in the following way. So one of the other things that we're doing at Glue is putting a proper licensing framework, where you can introduce the data right into training of models in a licensed way, that there's remuneration to the data owner as well, so that you get proper representation, right, of data sets on a broader basis with the appropriate controls. There's probably lifetime employment for the legal field in the implications of what data can get used for model training. There's already 1,000 lawsuits around, aimed at OpenAI because people arguing that they've used the wrong data or data that they didn't have license rights to. A fun little project for you is go start interacting with Claude or ChatGPT and asking it the data sources it's used, and then ask it, did you have the legal right to use that data source in the training? So fun little thing for you, for your project today, and you can quickly get the AI model arguing with itself.
I just did that with Sesame, with its new model. I asked it; it was very, very vague on its response. But Pat, your answer and your great question reminded me that data field, one of the data streams they're considering using is micro expressions. Like I think the Zoom CEO is, and I was like, please do not make me question my micro expressions during any Zoom call because I don't want that to be indicative of, I'm sure it would be indicative of things I'm happy and not happy about. Anyway, Pat, you are such a brain. I'm so eager to continue to learn from you, and this was an amazing session. Thank you so much on behalf of a room that loved talking and hearing from you, and you're the best. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Liz.